this morning, and looking forward to the presentation and update on all the Coast Guard activities and military activities. It's a time of great change, both in the U.S. and, of course, as we decrease the amount of sea ice and open up the lanes, the impact of the shipping operations. There's not a day that goes by that we don't see a new remark about the Russians and moving more materials over the top of the world route earlier and later. So I'm interested to see what we have scheduled for the Coast Guard and military to address some of those emerging threats and activities. Again, my name is Terry Smith. I'm the president. This is my final meeting as a board president for Commonwealth North, and I've had a great year, and just want to say thank you, Juanetta, for all of your support and Aaron's support over this year in bringing these types of programs to us in this new format. And I think you've done a great job, and I think that the organization is better off for it. Before we get started in today's program, our bylaws require an annual business meeting to elect our board class. There's 3 of them. The members met electronically to hold our annual elections for the board of directors, and we will install our new officers at the annual board meeting on January 27th. With that electronic election, I have the great pleasure of announcing our newly elected board members for the Commonwealth North organization. The slate proposed by the nominating committee was recently approved by a vote of the membership. The new board members are Ryan Binkley, publisher, Anchorage Daily News; Jason Evans, president and CEO of Rural Energy Enterprises; Marilyn Romano, regional vice president, Alaska Airlines; Bernie Smith, former commissioner, Regulatory Commission of Alaska; Ralph Townsend, director, UAE's Institute of Social and Economic Research; Isaac Vanderberg, executive director, Launch Alaska; and Miss Becky Wint Pearson, senior vice president, law and corporate advocacy for GCI. So we appreciate those board members that stayed on and those that are just joining us. On behalf of the board and our membership, I thank each of our new board members for your commitment to Commonwealth North and to Alaska. I also look forward to working with you and getting to know each of you, and bringing your passions to the table as we develop and work on public policy issues throughout the state of Alaska. We appreciate your time, your treasure, and your talent. I also want to thank Bob Cox, Mark Smith, and Meade Treadwell, who will be leaving the board this year as their terms expire. We thank them for their years of service as board members, but know that they will stay engaged in our programs and study groups this year. We appreciate each and every one of you. You've been just phenomenal as we've worked on some very complex issues over the last number of years. And moving to that, let's talk about the military and Coast Guard. They have long played an important role in Alaska's economy and civil society. Today's program will feature findings from recent research by the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development. These findings are part of the Alaska Defense Industry Resilience Initiative. This initiative is an ongoing assessment of the impacts and connections between the Alaska economy, the military, and the Coast Guard. We'll also hear from the commander of the Alaska Command, the Unified Command of Military Operations in and around Alaska, as well as District 17 of the U.S. Coast Guard. This program aligns with the work of our Arctic Policy Study Group, which was established by our board last year to review and update Commonwealth North's previous report on U.S. Arctic policy titled Why the Arctic Matters. This report can be found along with all of the other public policy reports at commonwealthnorth.org/publications. This work will soon come to a close. A new report is in the drafting process. I'd like to thank Meade Treadwell, Tom Barrett, Mort Buckenstedt, Bob Cox, and Gail Schubert for co-chairing the Arctic Policy Study Group. At this time, please join me in welcoming our panelists for today's program. Lieutenant General David Krumm, Commander of Alaska Command, Commander of the 11th Air Force, and Commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command Region at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. Rear Admiral Matthew Bell, District 17 Commander of the U.S. Coast Guard, District 17 serves the Alaska Maritime Region. Nola Klouda, Executive Director, University of Alaska Anchorage Center for Economic Development. The center leverages the resources of the university system to support economic growth in Alaska. It provides technical assistance and implements projects and programs that promote economic development across the state. Thank you to our head table. I'd also like to thank the Commonwealth North members who are online with us today. I invite you to turn on your camera for a moment as we acknowledge the contributions of our members and the ones that they have made through their support of and engagement in Commonwealth North. Remember, Commonwealth North was founded to provide nonpartisan public policy forums for Alaskans to better understand some of the most complex issues impacting our state, including energy, education, infrastructure, fiscal policy, and healthcare. And most recently, we've added food security. As always, for those of you that are not members, thank you for your interest and engagement. We invite you to join Commonwealth North and support our mission to illuminate Alaska's most critical issues. Now we'll hear from our first speaker, Nola Klouda, Executive Director of UACED Center for Economic Development. Nola, please unmute. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. So I hope everyone is looking at my screen right now, my title slide, but I'm Nola Klouda, Director of the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development. We are one of the programs that make up the UAA Business Enterprise Institute. And our focus is on, we've got a foot in both the world of practice of economic development and of research that informs that kind of economic development, and our concern being for economic growth and diversification of the state. Now, so I want to start off from an interesting, unusual spot talking about military impacts, economic impacts in Alaska. And I like to take a bit of a historical detour to tell this story. But I think something that Alaskans are often pretty familiar with, if you know a little bit of history in the state, is that the Alaska Highway was built during World War II by the military as a route to get people and supplies to the state, because the state was important, and I'm sorry, territory was important to the Pacific theater and close proximity to Japan at the time. So if you thought the Alaska Highway was bad last time you drove it, just imagine what it was like to ride when it looked like this. This very crude gravel pathway. But the Alaska Highway is a really interesting example and illustration of something that I think is a much bigger and more important trend when it comes to the military's role in the state's history, which is that the military has built a lot of economic foundations for Alaska that we now depend on and take for granted, and that we often don't think about as even really having an original military purpose. And this includes a lot of things like that are listed here, and some elements that are not listed here, where the military either directly built or somehow encouraged or facilitated the construction or development of some of these kinds of things. So the Alaska Railroad needed significant upgrading and improvement after World War II, and that was funded by the military because they needed a way to get into the interior bases. The airports in Anchorage and Fairbanks and smaller rural airfields around the state were built with federal money at the request of the military. The telecommunications infrastructure that formed the predecessor of the cell tower networks that we have today, the original telephone service and radio relay service that used to connect all the communities around the state, was built with a military purpose in mind that was also leveraged by the civilian world and later privatized. Port improvements, Seward, Valdez, and Whittier, even my employer, the University of Alaska system, research institutes like the Geophysical Institute, built in order to do research of interest to the military and to defense applications. So the military played a huge role in building Alaska and helping to make it into the sort of economy that it is today. If you go back to the mid-50s, a quarter of the state's population was active duty military. And when you add in civilian employees of the agencies, and when you add in contractors and add in the dependent family members of any of the above, almost half of the state's population in the mid-50s had a tie to the military. So this was a huge driver of what created of the push for statehood. Statehood itself had a military justification to it that was quite compelling to many members of Congress and to our five-star general president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower. Many senior military folks wanted to see Alaska be a state. They wanted to see it have a sort of more modernized economy that might support a military presence, and they wanted it to be populated more than it was at the time, more sparsely. Of course, you know, the Alaska Native people have been living in the territory and later state for a long time. The military wanted to see Alaska look like other states around the country, and for better or worse. And so the families and service members brought, you know, they brought something that looked like American suburban life to Alaska, and statehood followed from that. We used to be heavily dependent upon military as our major economic engine. Now, if we fast forward to today, you know, I think when we began this project, we knew that the military was important to Alaska. I think most Alaskans that are aware of our economy in broad terms know that the military is an important driver, know that the military is something that creates a lot of jobs. But we wanted to put specific numbers to that. Now, if we think about the military as an industry or the defense industry, you know, which we don't always think of in those terms, other industries in the state, you know, have their associations that do a really good job of showing how many jobs are created by that industry. You know, here are some examples. We've got mining, fisheries. We've got the oil and gas industry. We could also name the tourism industry. These all you know, create a lot of jobs. And somebody does periodically a report that shows the number of jobs created. So, you know, oil and gas, you know, almost 78,000. Mining, seafood, obviously produce a lot of jobs. These are the broader jobs that the outside of just direct employment in those, as money circulates, creates additional jobs. And so we decided, well, okay, well, we need to do that for the military as well in Alaska. We need to be able to put numbers to it. And so we did a type of analysis, input-output modeling, to show what the impacts are in terms of jobs. And this is the number that analysis produced, is that there are about 58,000 jobs that are tied to the military in some way in the state. You know, for reference, the state, at least pre-pandemic, had a little over 320,000 jobs. So this is a pretty good proportion. We wanted to talk about civilian employment tied to the military, because most of our employment data that we record, you know, is talking about civilian jobs, the civilian unemployment rate, and so on. So, okay, well, if we take out, you know, the uniformed folks, what are the civilian jobs created? And it's these numbers: 33,000 jobs that are civilian, and 1 in 10 civilian jobs. You know, 1/10 of all workers in the state having a tie to the military, and outside of, and if we take a broader definition of employment, total jobs, 1 in 6 jobs in the state have a tie to the military. And by the way, I should clarify something here. Most of what I'm talking about is the Department of Defense, you know, Army, Air Force predominantly, but the Coast Guard is part of our conversation as well, obviously under Department of Homeland Security, and it is included in these numbers as well. So how do we get from the amount of spending that we know from public data, amount of contract spending, and the number of personnel to the total number of jobs? How is that broken out? Well, there's almost 30,000 direct employees of Department of Defense or Coast Guard in Alaska, and that the largest portion of that, a little over 20,000 of those, are active duty folks that are based on our installations. But there's also several thousand civilian employees of DoD or the Coast Guard, and there are reservists and members of the National Guard that also get their pay, you know, through defense sources. So all of those added up, that's 30,000 jobs. When procurement spending occurs in support of those installations, we get this next number, the 10,000 figure. And that's really the first tier of contract spending. There's also subcontracting that happens below that level. A lot of those jobs are going to be with Alaska Native corporations, you know, that are very, very big and important in the contracting space. Then we have this additional tier of spending from businesses buying goods from other businesses, as well as from people who get a paycheck somehow from the defense chain, spending that in the local economy, and anything from groceries, rent, healthcare services, or any of the other things that households buy. So all of that together creates about 58,000 jobs. Now, I can tell you that there's some preliminary work that's going to be published soon. Muhsin Gatabi at the Institute of Social and Economic Research did a separate analysis using a different methodology, and the results from that show that our numbers are probably on the conservative side, that these numbers could easily be another 5,000 or 10,000 higher total. You could be approaching 70,000 jobs tied to defense and the Coast Guard in Alaska, and even greater impacts. It's also worth thinking about how that spending and how those impacts are distributed in the state, because they're not, equally spread everywhere evenly throughout the state. In the interior, this is where the effects are the largest on the local workforce. About a third of all civilian employment in the interior, and so we're including Fairbanks, North Star Borough, as well as the other areas highlighted here. But there are, of course, important installations at, in addition to Eielson and Wainwright, you've got Fort Greely and you have Clear Air Force Station. And those 4 installations together, are largely what produces these impacts. So 1 in 3 jobs have a tie to defense in the interior. So it dominates the interior economy for sure. I think in very, no uncertain terms, this is the economic driver for interior Alaska. We could also talk about mostly the effects that come from Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson and some associated activity in the Anchorage and Mat-Su region, and produces a few in gross terms more jobs than in the interior, but as a proportion of the economy, it's about 1 in 10 civilian jobs being tied to the military, which is enough to make it a really important anchor and source of stability, I think, for the Anchorage and Mat-Su economy, to have 1 in 10 jobs being tied to military spending. And what about the rest of Alaska? Now, one weakness to the type of analysis that we did is it doesn't work especially well to analyze the effects on a smaller population area, smaller than the areas that we talked about, the Anchorage and the interior. So all of these other regions, the remainder of the jobs, roughly 5,000 total, smaller percentage overall of the workforce. But this does obscure a couple of important pieces of information. You have places like Kodiak, where the Coast Guard base is every bit as important to that community as J-Bear might be to Anchorage, or even as Eielson and Wainwright might be to Fairbanks. You have places like Sitka, Juneau, Ketchikan, where the Coast Guard base plays an important, continuous role there. You have places in around the state that have large remediation projects that are formerly used defense sites funded through Department of Defense that create a lot of local jobs. So I don't want to gloss over the importance of some of those pieces too. Almost every borough and census area in Alaska has reported some level of defense contract spending in the last 3 years. So all but one borough or census area in the state in that category. So defense spending and Coast Guard spending really do hit the whole state. Now, our initiative overall is this is one aspect, one function of it is some of this impact work. What we're trying to do, we have some funding that was the impetus behind this project. The Office of Economic Adjustment, which has since been rebranded actually recently. It's a unit under Department of Defense that helps communities and states adjust to changes in defense spending and helps them strategically look at their dependence on defense and how the local vendor bases and communities that depend on defense might be strengthened. And so our work is really trying to identify what that looks like. And so we've got a collection of reports, and I'll share the link to our website, but the economic impacts are an important aspect of it. Other sorts of assets, and we've got a vendor survey that was part of this work too, and an asset inventory, and some other pieces that'll be forthcoming that dig more into the data on what the defense and Coast Guard buy in Alaska. One thing that I want to mention by way of passing is that we've also had some preliminary recommendations. We had a consultancy, TIP Strategies, that does a lot of this work at the national level on defense that left us with a couple of recommendations for state government, and these are essentially twofold. One is the creation of a military coalition or alliance. This would be a council that meets under the banner of state government, and an Office of Military Affairs, something that's a bit separate from the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs. And both of these bodies would work on defense issues around retention of our existing military presence, potential expansion or enhancement opportunities at a statewide level. Opportunities come along in the defense space that require some state level action a lot of times to achieve them. And right now there's the opportunity to get the KC-46 aircraft at ALCOM, the F-35s, being a recent success story to get those aircraft to ALCOM, and potential future opportunities around the Arctic, and these often require inputs from the state to ensure that military personnel are happy and well adjusted in Alaska, and certain kinds of infrastructure that might meet their needs, and so there needs to be somebody in their view that is responsible for helping to facilitate that with state government, that it would have an economic development function. So with that, I am going to hand things back to continue with the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nolan. Now we'll hear from Rear Admiral Bell. Admiral Bell, please unmute.
Great, thanks, Terry. Good afternoon, all. So it's a pleasure to join General Krumm here on this distinguished panel. I think this is the fourth time that the General and I have spoke together on our cooperative efforts here in the state. So a tremendous opportunity for us to talk together. So as we kind of already did in the introduction, so Coast Guard presence here in southern Alaska, the Bering Sea, Gulf of Alaska continues to be persistent, capable, and it matches the major population, economic concentrations, and of course the focus on maritime activities. We ensure maritime safety and security in the region by conducting search and rescue, fisheries enforcement, inspection, certifications for ships and maritime facilities. We ensure compliance with U.S. and international safety and security laws and regulations. And of course, we prevent and respond to oil spills and other water pollution. Today, we have ships patrolling the Bering Sea. We have aircraft conducting missions out of Kodiak and Sitka. And across the southeast, we have fast response cutters and buoy tenders underway, standing the watch. Coast Guard strengthens U.S. leadership in Alaska and the Arctic regions by effective partnerships with our federal, state, local, and tribal governments, and of course, industry members. Although we have lived and served in southern Alaska for most of the Coast Guard existence, our access to and operations in western and northern Alaska have been temporary in nature, and no permanent infrastructure or operating forces along the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas. Coast Guard cutter and air station patrols make up the majority of the Coast Guard's operational, and to that end, I think, seasonal presence in the Bering Straits and Arctic regions. We provide expeditionary capabilities where and when needed most. I think building off that last statement, I'm excited about the Coast Guard presence of the future, with our acquisitions progressing for the offshore patrol cutters, the polar security cutters. The United States has vital national interest in those polar regions. Through an increase in capability and capacity, the polar security cutters will enable the U.S. to maintain defense readiness in the Arctic and Antarctic regions, enforce treaties and other laws to safeguard both industry and the environment, provide ports, waterways, and coastal security, and provide logistical support, including vessel escort, to facilitate the movement of goods and personnel necessary to support scientific research, commerce, national security activities, and of course, maritime safety. Coast Guard has contracted the building of 6 new polar security cutters to ensure national year-round access to the polar regions. Construction of our first polar security cutter is planned to begin this coming year, with planned delivery in 2024. And of course, recapitalization of the polar fleet will continue over the next decade. Speaking of Arctic capabilities, so we're fortunate to have the nation's sole heavy icebreaker deploy to the northern high latitudes this winter to support the Coast Guard's Arctic strategy. As of today, the Polar Star is in the Bering Sea and points north to conduct their deployment to the Arctic through next month to expand our coverage, to conduct Coast Guard missions, patrol the U.S. maritime boundary line, and contribute to maritime domain awareness and strengthen international and intergovernmental partnerships, and of course, protect the U.S. presence and sovereignty. The deployment enhances and informs our capability to operate effectively in a dynamic Arctic. It strengthens a rules-based order in our Arctic waters and allows us to innovate and adapt to promote resiliency and prosperity. The cutter will primarily be operating in the Bering and Chukchi Seas looking for first-year ice. This provides a great opportunity to refine and develop the future generation of icebreaker operators. They have been supported with a logistics stop in Dutch Harbor, and they will likely make a port call here in Juneau on their way home next month. Continuing on that Arctic thread, I think we have one of the few countries in the world that has territories above the Arctic Circle. You know, to state the obvious to our listeners, we have shared borders with Russia and Canada in the Arctic. The Arctic is strategically important because it contains a significant amount of the world's undiscovered gas, oil, and mineral reserves, and more than half of the U.S.'s fishing stocks come from the nation's exclusive economic zones here off Alaska. Melting ice is opening up the sea lanes that could not have existed before, and it's becoming more and more accessible, which means more exploration and tourism, shipping, and of course, possible conflict as world powers compete for their stake in what this region has to offer. Increased international activity up here directly affects our sovereignty. Competing demands for resources and increased shipping traffic will bring risks closer to our shores and closer to potential conflict and environmental catastrophes. That's why it's important to ensure safe, secure, and environmentally responsive maritime activities across Alaska. Protection of species and potential access to future food sources are linked to long-term conservation efforts that require enforcement and oversight for which the Coast Guard has adapted well. As the nation's consistent maritime presence in this region, the Coast Guard continues to provide increasingly valuable partnerships, maritime domain awareness, search and rescue capabilities, ice breaking, fisheries enforcement, and vessel, and of course, those facility safety examinations I mentioned earlier. The area is so massive and so remote that simply providing coverage has been a challenge for us. Other nations, China and Russia specifically, have invested in presence, and I think are pushing those boundaries up here where we need to be able to respond effectively. In order for the U.S. to protect its sovereign interests in the U.S. Arctic and positively shape that future of governance in the region, it needs the capability to project a presence 365 days a year. So what are we, the Coast Guard, doing for investments in the future? So in short, from my Coast Guard perspective, and I've said this in the past, in comparison to our neighbors, we're lagging a little behind. But current investments will be closing the gap over the coming years. Recent contract awards for the polar security cutters and the offshore patrol cutters are great progress. Fielding and upgrading the C-130Js to Kodiak and patrols to Alaska D-17 AOR by our national security cutters are huge steps to influencing our home waters. Russia and China, I think, effectively exemplify that competition. Both have declared the Arctic a strategic priority, and both have made significant investments in new or refurbished capabilities, and both are exerting a direct and indirect influence across the region. Relationship-wise, I think we have the advantage of a history of providing the nation's most consistent maritime presence since the mid-1800s. We have enduring relationships with those who work, travel, and live up here in the last frontier. Over the next several years, I see new construction and recapitalization efforts totaling more than, I think, $280 million. Most of this supports our basing and home porting efforts in Ketchikan, Kodiak, Seward, and Sitka. In recent approved fiscal year 21 funding, I see nearly $40 million in maintenance and minor construction, mostly to base Kodiak, but also much needed projects at our communication sites here throughout Southeast Alaska. If we look down the road 10 or 15 years, I predict that the demand signal for our normal statutory services only increasing in response to the growing activity across U.S. Arctic waters. I think as long as there are geostrategic competition with near-peer competitors and continued efforts to gain influence over and control of the resources, infrastructure, and sea routes in the Arctic, the Coast Guard will continue to play an important and unique national role. From my perspective, I believe the Coast Guard should be well positioned to provide mobile and expeditionary mission services in the greater Alaska Arctic regions and their connecting waters. To that last point, in Alaska, search and rescue support almost entirely means providing services to the region's coastal communities and those indigenous Alaskans who make up most of the region's populations. I found it interesting that Nolan was focused on the central interior of Alaska, yet kind of had a big question mark as to what influences Western Alaska and Northern Alaska. That's where the Coast Guard influences that, I think, greatly. We of course rely on the experiences and knowledge of those residents to aid us in performing those missions. We would not have the positive outcomes that we've had without them. And to that end, here over the last year, despite the adverse COVID-19 operating conditions in 2020, the Coast Guard deployed enforcement task force to a number of coastal and isolated communities. These operations bolster community support from local leaders and fishermen, and ultimately the community at large, to improve their own safety and survivability at sea. Preventing accidents from occurring is our primary goal. Response, though, is what we do. But of course, I'd rather work ourselves out of that business. But the Coast Guard does much more to support Alaska's fisheries than just law enforcement. If we can't help facilitate getting products to market, we won't have a commercial fishing industry. Everybody likes to talk about Dutch Harbor as an example of the #1 or #2 commercial fishing port in terms of tonnage, but that's only part of the Alaska story. So when you look to smaller places like Togiak or Port Molar or Bristol Bay, and some of those Bering Sea communities that participate in community development quota programs, it's that foreign flagged cargo ship that exports the catch that these fisheries depend upon. The Coast Guard does a lot of things behind the scene to ensure these ships, to ensure this industry is operating safely. We require alternative planning criteria plans to reduce the risk of accidents and to ensure that salvage plans are in place if something goes awry. So we conduct some port state control boardings, like to support the Red Dog Mine efforts to ensure these ships are in compliance with both international and US requirements. And we also work closely with partner agencies like NOAA to ensure that ships can safely navigate to places they need to go to support important commercial fisheries. And so for some closing thoughts here, the Coast Guard's goal for coastal community outreach and engagement is to engage and conduct our outreach with communities well before we take any law enforcement or regulatory action. We try to communicate these rules and probable outcomes to them and recommend avenues of compliance. This is an important part of our capacity building efforts. Coast Guard engagement and outreach takes place at the organizational, community, and operational level. Everyone in the Coast Guard has an important role to play, from when I interact with tribal leadership, or we bring VIPs through the state, or we speak at events like this one here at Commonwealth North, or to when we push a flight crew to conduct an operational flight with a native wildlife expert. All of these activities connect us with each other and offer opportunities to listen and learn from our important neighbors. All of these activities support our Arctic strategic outlook by establishing a persistent awareness of the Arctic domain. We strengthen our everlasting partnerships and support regional resilience. The Coast Guard is uniquely positioned to provide active and committed leadership to institutions contributing to a conflict-free Arctic. And part of the way we do that up here in Alaska is by participating in things like the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, and maintaining an effective working relationships with our Canadian and Russian neighbors. The Coast Guard's been providing Alaska services since 1867. While the environment and the needs of the residents and waterways have changed over time, the Coast Guard has always adapted to provide the best service and value possible. Through overflights, routine patrols, and relationships with industries and native communities, I say we have our finger on the pulse of the region, and we have assets to deter, prevent, and respond to events ranging from rescue cases to oil spills, fishery enforcement, and national security events, and more. Everything we do is to ensure secure, safe, and environmentally responsible maritime activities here in Alaska. And I really do appreciate the invitation to participate in today's presentation and the discussions, and I'll happy to stick around for questions that we may have later. And so with that, Nolan or Terry, I'll turn it back over to you. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Admiral Bell. Lastly, General Krumm, please unmute, and I'd like to welcome you to bring your remarks forward.
Hey, thanks, Terry, and to Commonwealth North, Winetta and Aaron and Nolan, thank you for that. You know, Matt Bell is right. I think this is the fourth, maybe the fifth time we've talked. You think at this point I would have learned to go before he speaks, because following him is always a detriment to my own speaking skills. But I'm happy to be here with you today. Congratulations to our new board members too. I know several of you, and you certainly have a great group of both Alaskans and Americans there. You know, the Alaska and military, we've been together a long time. On October 18th, 1967, American troops replaced the Russian troops when we did the transfer of Alaska. And we've really been intertwined. And it's a combination of things. First off, it's Alaska's importance and what it has to offer in the way of natural resources like gold, oil, fish. But even more importantly is its strategic location. And that strategic location has been a critical part of our armed forces. And because of that, and I thought Nolan did a great job of articulating where we've been and how we've gotten here, we're obviously a big part of Alaska. But if you don't mind, I'm going to take a couple of moments to talk to you about the narrative that we have going forward and why I think that interconnection and the possible increase in military activities can be going forward. And you know, the world's changing in many ways. Nolan covers some of this, and Matt covers some of it. Climate, technology, but I would also say some of the ideologies in some of our nation states are changing as well. And those are constantly alternating, and no more so than up here in the Arctic. We all know the Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the planet. That warming, as well as technological advancements, are creating very unique opportunities. Commerce in the way that the sea routes that will allow Asian countries like China to more quickly get their goods to markets in Europe, by some counts, up to 2 weeks that they can save in transit cost, which in a business, as many of you know, like shipping or like manufacturing and getting your goods to market, that is a huge productivity increase. The sea routes allow tourism. When cruising becomes a thing again after the pandemic, you know, we had already seen cruises in the Arctic during the summer, and I expect we'll see that again. But that diminishing sea ice is also creating access to natural resources, gas, oil, minerals, and of course, fish in the form of protein, or protein in the form of fish. You know, Matt talked a little about that. I got some numbers. I hope you'll just let me address them here real quick. The U.S. Geological Survey has assessed that above the Arctic Circle, about 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of the world's undiscovered gas, mostly in less than 500 meters of water offshore. That accounts for about 90 billion barrels of oil, 669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids. Plans are already in the work to try to harvest those, but also to mine rare earth metals, things like copper, phosphorus, and platinum. You know, they estimate that Greenland's southern regions hold about 25% of the world's rare earth metals, which, as you know, we can't have an iPhone without. So the manufacture of electronic components. And I think we have to be clear-eyed that other nations, regardless of whether the United States chooses to pursue those natural resources, other nations will not let those potential treasures go. And so we should expect them to come to the Arctic region and to try to protect their interests and to utilize those natural resources. The world's also changing on technology. The technology to get to those resources, but also from a military standpoint, technology is changing in weapons and sensors and communications. And if you think about it, in the past, America was always defended by its location. We had friendly neighbors to the north and south, and they were protected by two great oceans to our east and west, and then the Arctic was kind of impassable. But now with the multi-sea ice, but also with the changing of technology, what we found is the Arctic is no longer a barrier, but a potential avenue of access. And so because of that, our world is changing, and those states that are changing their ideologies, we have to consider as well. You know, Matt talked about countries like Russia and China. Both have clearly articulated the importance of the Arctic in their writings, and they've both taken steps to increase their presence up here in the Arctic. On the military, what I get concerned with is how have those countries behaved elsewhere? And will that behavior repeat itself in the Arctic? I think we can look to the not so distant past and see the way Russia took over Crimea, the ongoing actions of the Chinese in the South China Sea. So it's obvious that those countries will go against international norms and standards when it best suits them. And I think we have to be prepared for them to do so. And I think the response by DoD has been exactly right. There has been acknowledgement. So in any process of improvement, first you have to acknowledge the problem. And I think we've done that. The Arctic is a place where we have to rebalance and focus. And that means Alaska, because as I've become kind of semi-famous for saying, the only reason the United States is an Arctic nation is because of Alaska. And so because of that, if we want to have leadership and presence in the Arctic, it begins here. We've seen multiple Arctic strategies written by the Department of Defense, not only from the Office of Secretary of Defense, but also by individual services. And they focused on understanding the environment. They focused on domain awareness and capabilities and capacity to defend the homeland and to protect our interests. And then with that, what I think that means you will see from the Department of Defense and the military specifically is there will be a need to invest and sustain capabilities and capacities in Alaska. And I envision this to be moving forward in various ways. And then the first way to go for a much more robust exercise and training opportunities up here, and acknowledging the fact that you can't just be here in the summer. You know, a lot of our training right now is focused during the summer months. I think that we're going to expand that to be a 365-day a year kind of training force. Nolan talked about some of the additions that we have ongoing. The F-35s are continuing to move to Eielson Air Force Base and build up the presence. And we're looking at various initiatives to improve our communications and sensor capabilities. You know, I think details and focus are going to play out as we go along. But the first step we've already taken. And what I think that means for Alaska is a potentially larger economic impact. But from my standpoint, what that really means is that we're more secure and that we're more protective of our resources and our nation's interests up here as we go forward. I think that today, a couple of people have asked me about, what does the new administration mean? So, today's a great day in American democracy, right? We had a transition to a new administration, a new president. And I don't think that that changes the importance of the Arctic. It may change how we go forward in natural resources or procuring those, but I don't think it means that we will retreat from the Arctic and cede that to other countries. I think that what this means is America's leadership and presence needs to be a part of the Arctic. We need to find ways to sustain ourselves and to be those leaders up here in the North. And I think that that starts here in Alaska. So I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope I give you a little bit of a perspective on why we think the military is here, and hopefully here to continue the great mission. And as always, we're very grateful for the incredible support we get from our Americans and from particularly the Alaska state population. So thanks.
Well, thank you very much to both Admiral Bell and General Krumm. Your teams and the family sacrifices that all of your members, service members, give to our communities around the world. We're in debt to you, and we appreciate it. So I just wanted to pass that on, and with that, I'd like to bring Juanetta forward to engage our members that are online and see if we can't bring some questions forward.
Great, thank you, Terry. We do have a number of questions. Admiral Bell, I'm going to start with you. I know that you've addressed this question with our Arctic Policy Study Group, and I know it's a sensitive question, but could you speak to the potential for the Coast Guard to establish a Coast Guard base in the Arctic?
Sure, Juanetta. So thanks for the question. So an Arctic base is, I'll call it problematic for lack of more descriptive terms. I think there's some encouraging language in the NDAA this year that talks about establishing a a deep water port in the Arctic. I think Senator Sullivan had some great efforts and work behind the scenes to make that happen. What does that look like for the Coast Guard going forward? I think we're just gonna have to wait to see how the final port, what it looks like and what services it can offer. But as far as establishing a permanent presence there, that becomes difficult for us because all our mission sets take us all over the state. As I kind of articulated before, the Coast Guard has an expeditionary force structure, and we go to the greatest need at a time when we can. So that could take us anywhere from somewhere in the Arctic to all the way out to the end of the Aleutian chain to the center of the Gulf of Alaska. Any one of those would, becomes immaterial of where that home port or where that basing is located. I look at most of our major infrastructure is going into Kodiak. I call that our gateway to the Arctic, although it's 1,000 miles from the Arctic. I understand that, but if there's other services or other port facilities that are created elsewhere, then we're certainly going to take advantage of those and use those to our advantages as we make those transits north and south. Thanks.
Great, thank you. For Nolan, we've got a couple of questions. I'm just going to start with this one. The primary being, can you just say a little bit about what the Center for Economic Development does and how you otherwise support economic activity in Alaska?
Sure. Thank you, Annetta. So we define our work as having kind of three main areas of focus, and one is entrepreneurship and the promotion of entrepreneurship. We do a lot of training for folks that are starting businesses. We have a accelerator program where we have even within the student population programs that are to help student entrepreneurs get going and to match them with startup companies and internships. We also do a lot of applied research work along the lines of what I presented today and on a number of other topics, and then also help technical assistance to communities, especially around helping communities and regions of the state with strategic planning for economic development purposes. Those are the three main things.
Great, thanks Nolan. A question for General Krumm. Can you speak to how far along, what's the progress with regard to situating the two F-35 squadrons, where that stands? And then an expanded question would be, I guess this would be both for General Krumm and Admiral Bell. Do you guys foresee any future Navy involvement or infrastructure in Alaska? So let's start with the F-35 question, General Krumm.
Well, the F-35 buildup at ILCN is going very well. Matter of fact, we did something we call an elephant walk. Elsewhere, we call it a moose walk up here a few weeks ago, where we actually generated and flew all of our aircraft up at ILCN. It's a tremendous achievement. So we're in the double digits of fighters. I think that we will reach our initial combat capability on time. The second squadron was stood up a few weeks ago. We continue to get an influx of maintainers, base support personnel, and we're continuing to build some facilities there on the base. And the range, J-Park as we call it, is working pretty well. And so we're pretty happy with the progress going forward. On the Navy side, I'll let Matt answer for the Coast Guard. The Navy presence up here, as the ALCOM commander, I don't have any naval assets obviously assigned other than just some personnel. Those are governed by Fleet Forces North down in the lower 48. But what General Van Ert, the commander of NORAD and Northern Command, has said is he believes that presence is going to be needed. Now, whether it's done in the form of infrastructure of a base or if it's done by temporal visits and a sustained visit where they rotate equipment out, I think that remains to be seen. But I think that there is an acknowledgement that we need to be here in conjunction with our Coast Guard brothers and sisters there on the sea. Now I'll turn the rest of it over to Matt.
Yeah, thanks, General. So from the Navy perspective, I think I think the best place to start right now is their newly released Arctic strategy. I think that just came out last week. I think it's titled a Blue Arctic, right? So I think it's their strategic blueprint for the Arctic. My overall impressions is that their preamble, scene setting descriptions, which talk about changing environment, enhanced greater power competition, threats to existing rules-based order, those type of thing. I think set the Coast Guard and the Navy to be working together. I don't think there's any presence coming in the near future. I think most of their objectives are holding to elevated exercises, operations. We've already got a couple of joint efforts, exercises planned for later this summer, increasing that interoperability for a total joint force, if you will, I think is incredibly important. And we'll see that continuing to evolve and continuing to grow over the future. But as far as, permanent presence, that's a great question to, I think, focus back and reference back to that Navy's intents, especially as the CNO, establishes his priorities under the new administration.
Great. Admiral Bell, while I've got you on camera, or did, there is a lot of interest on discussion about the Arctic or the polar ice cutters and where they're located. And you want to speak to what the plans are for those assets and how you see that deployment and how you see that strategically rolling out to Alaska in the future?
Yeah, so excited about that acquisition today. So Annetta, it's a great question. So we are starting construction on the first now. I think the long lead items for number 2 are well underway already. My understanding is their first operational patrol will likely occur in 2024, 2025, once they come off the acceptance trials and do some of those initial training runs to look at the performance of that new design. Current plans are for them to be home ported in Seattle, at least for the first one anyway. And then their initial patrols, which will likely be going to the Arctic and the Antarctic, obviously working up to replace, Polar Star is their first line of efforts. And so I would imagine their first trip will be to Antarctic to support that valuable mission. But I also see them doing initial patrols up here, especially to look at capabilities, to look at their performance factors in the water. This is much closer to Seattle than the Antarctic is. So I see that happening. Of course, that's all conjecture on my part since the cutter doesn't even float as of yet. But we'll eventually get to 3 of those. My understanding is we'll get to 6, of new class of cutters that support this Polar Security Cutter initiative. And we'll see those literally plying the waters here for the Coast Guard over the next decade. And where the future fleet of those that, after hull number 1 is going to be home ported is still rests at the higher headquarters level. And those are, continuing ongoing discussions as to where to home port those is, as I kind of said before, immaterial where they're home ported, their operational mainstay is going to be here in the Arctic and down south in the Antarctic. And the home port's just a place for, crew rest, but major maintenance cycles for those cutters when they're off hours. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Well, it's very exciting to see that development for polar ice cutters in Alaska in the future. And in terms of the buildup for those new assets, how do you see the training for personnel for those new cutters happening? Where and how will they be acclimated for polar operations?
Yeah, thanks, Annetta. It's a great question. That's, perfectly aligned with the Polar Star up here now. So they have some incredible opportunities now in the ice, in that first year ice, to provide officer of the deck training, provide some training to ice pilots, to also continue to look and operate that ship in the Arctic. So the ice in the Arctic is different than the ice in Antarctic. It's a different time of the year. I'll call it soft and mushy down south during the summer times. It's hard and rigid here in the winter time. So that requires a different approach to finding a lead through the ice, finding a path through the ice. So all of those folks standing the watch up there, whether it's on the bridge or in the engine room, are learning, I'll call it the skills, the expertise to continue to apply that trade and be able to influence that next generation of ice breaking pilots and captains. When we combine that with what we learn on Cutter Healy during their summer deployments, which Healy will be back up here coming this summer, those pool of expertise will continue to inform not only this current fleet, but I think those future fleets down the road.
Great. All right. I think for General Krumm and perhaps for Admiral Bell, communications, as Nolan indicated, was greatly impacted in Alaska by the needs of the military. And how do you see communications and the gaps that currently exist, particularly in the high Arctic, being impacted? We see a number of private providers that will be coming online with not only terrestrial fiber, but satellite services. So can you speak to how communications will be addressed by the military and the Coast Guard, and maybe speak to any gaps or vulnerabilities that you see now that exist and how we can address those?
I think that that's going to be the basis for how we go forward. So communications is just the cornerstone of how we operate, how we talk to each other, how we maneuver with respect to each other and potential competitors or adversaries. So communications is a key part, and I've been cheered by the inclusion of some funds that have dedicated some polar orbit communications. I've had numerous discussions with NORAD Northcom and as well as the congressional delegation. I think we have a unique opportunity to really have what we call dual use. And so, our ability to utilize common communications architectures with not a sole military purpose. So I think, as we look forward, OneWeb has some proposals, SpaceX has some proposals for some of the polar orbits. As we look forward, I think we have a real opportunity to both use that to better our understanding of the environment and to improve our communications. I'm really excited about those satellite orbits and the possibilities for that. And I think that's going to be a key part of how we go forward. Matt?
Yes, sir. Thanks. And so just to build on that, I would just add two words as kind of a collective umbrella for that, and that's investment and innovation. And maybe you could turn it around and say innovation and investment. But regardless of where we go, whether that's to expand, I'll call it VHF coverage here in Southeast to Western Alaska, or to global satellite communications, whether you're in the high latitudes, which are already difficult, to the remote regions of the Bering Sea, either of those or any of those are going to require some investment and innovation. We can't continue to go off of I'll call it old school. Some of that technology doesn't allow us to talk and communicate in real time to the people that need that. I mean, look back to Nolan's presentation for where we were at in the 40s and 50s across Alaska, and look how far we've come. Okay, we're 70 years later. We would think that rise in technology would get us even more. But when we talk about, easy and cost-efficient access to 5G, well, that's one thing to talk about commercial availability. But when we talk about applying that to a military role or a Department of Homeland Security role, I think we're going to need to be a little more innovative, because that scarce dollar that we're going to want to invest that smartly down the road. And we are excited about the prospects of making changes, whether that's fiber or satellite. All of those are going to provide not only the military and the Coast Guard opportunities, but I think that the population in Alaska as a whole.
Well, thank you all three so much. We did have some additional questions, but we're just past the 1 o'clock hour, and I know that you all have challenging schedule issues that are pressing upon you. So I'm going to turn back to Terry for some closing comments. Terry?
Well, my comments are brief as well. I just wanted to re-extend our thank yous to General Krumm, Admiral Bell, Nolan, for joining us today, and your great presentations, and again, all the work you do. We're just in awe of the effort that you put forward and your team members put forward every day to protect the nation. And thank you everyone online for joining us today. And if you're not a member yet, I encourage you to become a member of Commonwealth North. We need your time, we need your talent, we need your experience to help us break up and understand these complex public policy issues that we that we face every day. And of course, as we've mentioned before, they change faster than ever. So we need you to come to the table and join us. So thank you, Juanetta. Thank you, Aaron, for putting this on today. And thank you for all of our presenters today as well. And with that, we're adjourned.
Thank you, Terry. And I'll just remind the audience that our next program is February 3rd. We'll be welcoming former Secretary of State for the state of Maine, Matt Dunlap, and State Representative Kyle Bailey, also from Maine, to talk about ranked choice voting, which was approved by the Alaska voters. And so that'll be an opportunity for us to learn from their experiences in Maine. We'll also be joined by Lieutenant Governor Kevin Meyer and Gail Fanumiai, who is the director of our Division of Elections. So we think that'll be an informative program, and we hope to see everyone there as well. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.